Good morning. Thank you so much, Deborah. I really appreciated your remarks, and it was lovely to be reminded of the extraordinary presence and history of Ella Baker. I'd also like to thank the University of Virginia Women's Center and Hepzibah for inviting me to come and join you all today. It's a great day to be here, and I'm so excited to hear more about the work of all of you in addressing these important issues. Ella Baker once said that one's words are important only as they help people to do things that are of value to themselves. And we've had too much of the mesmerizing type of talking. As much as I would like to mesmerize all of you today with my dazzling words, as she would call them, my true goal today is to spark a conversation, much along the lines of Ella's pedagogy, about the need for, the urgency of, and the opportunities to build a domestic human rights movement here in the United States. In fact, human rights are a central part of our history. I'm going to share a little bit of that history with you today from Carol Anderson's book, Eyes Off the Prize, which is also an extraordinary book that I would recommend. The domestic civil rights movement in the 1940s and 50s started with a vision of human rights for all people in the U.S. After World War II, the United States participated in the founding of the United Nations and in the negotiations over an international human rights treaty. With global sentiment united in the commitment to prevent the atrocities that occurred during World War II, the United States joined other countries in establishing a commission on human rights with a mandate to investigate human rights violations wherever they occurred. After World War II, there was also an explosion of savagery against African Americans across the South. In 1946, an African American veteran, come home from the war, was in Alabama, and he removed a Jim Crow sign from a trolley. That resulted in the streetcar conductor shooting him with his pistol, and the chief of police hunted him down and executed him as he tried to escape his attacker. In South Carolina, another veteran who complained about Jim Crow transportation had his eyes gouged out with the butt of a sheriff's billy club. In Tennessee, a black veteran defended his mother from a beating, and when a lynching was planned against him, the sheriff's troopers took their machine guns and fired a barrage of shots into the black area of town. Malcolm X said, "How is a black man going to get his civil rights before he wins his human rights?" If the American black man will start thinking about his human rights and then start thinking of himself as part of the world's greatest people, he will see that he has a case for the United Nations. And so African American organizations, horror-struck by these killings, decided to embrace the human rights agenda as one that offered the chance to expand their struggle. The language and norms of human rights spoke to education, healthcare, housing, and employment, needs that many communities of color are still struggling with today. And so the first petition raising concerns about human rights violations against African Americans was filed by the National Negro Congress in June of 1946. The response of the U.S. government, you might guess. The government declared that the National Negro Congress was a communist front organization involved in un-American activities. And a year and a half later, the Congress was forced to close to merge with another organization because it had lost its supporters and funding. But the NAACP, under the leadership of W.E.B. Du Bois and Walter White, determined that in fact the legislatures and courts of the United States had been completely ineffective at addressing their concerns. It seemed that the United Nations was a new arena for pushing for the rights of African Americans. And so in October of 1947, the NAACP presented the UN Human Rights Commission with a very formal, very long petition outlining multitude of human rights violations against African Americans, asking them to take this issue up on their agenda. The NAACP also waged a very effective media battle, winning several supportive editorials across the country questioning what the U.S. policies were at the UN. How is it that the United States was championing the rights of minorities in other parts of the world, but refusing to consider its own record on this issue? The UN Commission on Human Rights was deeply split over whether or not to consider this petition. The petition was championed by the Soviets, but absolutely refused by the U.S. After several days of debate, the Commission rejected consideration of the NAACP petition. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was furious with the NAACP for embarrassing the U.S. government, submitted her resignation from the board of directors of the NAACP. And it was only when she was assured that the NAACP would focus on domestic struggles that she agreed to stay on the board. And so the struggle of African American organizations to engage the human rights system was quickly thwarted as the Cold War heated up. When President Eisenhower came to power in 1953, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, announced that the U.S. had decided to abandon the human rights declarations and treaties. They declared that in addition to being impractical, those treaties harbored communistic notions and were a direct threat to the basic liberties protected by the Constitution. The NAACP, pressured by Cold War politics and chastised by their so-called liberal allies, decided to reincarnate itself as an American organization and to retreat from the struggle for human rights. The fight for Black equality was now limited to the narrowly confined traditional arena of civil rights. The goal of economic and social rights, tainted by its association with Soviet politics, was overtly removed from the NAACP's agenda. Yet one of the greatest leaders of the Black freedom movement, Ella Baker, challenged this position, not openly, but through her actions and philosophy. She contributed so much to the civil rights movement, but Ella Baker's grassroots organizing style and her commitment to democratic decision-making challenged the practices of the traditional civil rights movement in fundamental ways. Her history and experience working with so many leading African American organizations, as Deborah outlined, the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, pushed those organizations to embrace a more democratic and egalitarian structure and practices. Throughout her life, she mentored young people and challenged them to embrace a class analysis of racism and injustice that allied them with those at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy. Her grassroots organizing style established a completely different model of gender relations, challenging men to rethink masculinity and women to rethink their roles in society. Ella Baker was a human rights activist. She sought to place those who were most directly affected by human rights violations at the center, the leadership of the movement. She built alliances across race, gender, political ideology, and class, and other distinctions in order to demonstrate the power of collaborative effort. She focused on those issues that were most important to the marginalized and disenfranchised, including employment, housing, and education. And she emphasized long-term community organizing as the critical work of the movement, at least, if not more important than legal strategies and policy advocacy. She believed that the process of building a movement for social transformation has to allow for, encourage, and nurture the transformation of the human beings involved. She believed that movement leaders cannot condemn hierarchy or elitism in society, but then emulate those same values in their own work and personal interactions. Human rights were a central part of her work, and we need that work more than ever today. Let's take a look at what progress has been made over the last 6 decades since the civil rights won some of its landmark victories. Let's start with education. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka that state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students were unconstitutional. The unanimous decision, and boy don't we miss those days, ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. What's going on today? Today, American schools are more segregated by race and class than they were when Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. The average white child in America attends a school that is 77% white, and where just 32% of the student body lives in poverty. The average black child attends a school that is 59% poor, but only 29% white. The typical Latino kid is similarly segregated. His school is 57% poor and 27% white. So overall, 1/3 of all black and Latino children sit every day in classrooms that are 90 to 100% black and Latino. 60 years later. What about housing? The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was a landmark piece of legislation that provided for equal housing opportunities regardless of race, creed, or national origin. Title VIII of the Act is commonly known as the Fair Housing Act. It prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, or financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and since 1974, gender. Since 1988, the Act protects people with disabilities and families with children. But according to a new analysis of census data from 2010, a study by Brown University and the Russell Sage Foundation found that ethnic identity trumps income as a predictor of where people live. Among minority households, even those with relatively high incomes tend to be clustered in neighborhoods where most of their neighbors are the same race and many are poor. The lead researcher behind the study said, "Race trumps income more than we would have expected. If you look at the characteristics of neighborhoods where affluent African Americans and Latinos live, they just don't have the same characteristics of neighborhoods where whites with similar incomes live. In fact, the pattern is so pervasive that many black and Latino families earning $75,000 or more per year live in communities with much higher concentrations of poverty than white households earning less than $40,000 a year." And why is this important? Because communities in which 20% or more of the population is below the poverty line tend to have fewer public or private resources. Everything from quality parks, schools, teachers, to clean streets, to banks, grocery stores, and dry cleaners. Now let's look at voting rights, a central piece of the work of the Civil Rights Movement. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting practices that had been responsible for the widespread disenfranchisement of African Americans. Echoing the language of our 15th Amendment of the Constitution, the Act prohibits states from imposing any voting qualification or prerequisite to voting or standard, practice, or procedure that denies or abridges the right of any citizen to vote on account of race or color. Specifically, Congress intended the act to outlaw the practice of requiring otherwise qualified voters to pass literacy tests in order to register to vote. This was the way that many southern states had prevented African Americans from voting. Now let's look at what's happened in the last few years. A number of states have adopted new laws restricting who can vote and how. Usually this is done in the name of stopping voter fraud, a mythical problem, and one that has spurred a number of restrictions. For example, the number of states with laws requiring voters to show government-issued photo ID has quadrupled in the last year. In 2012, at least 34 legislatures have introduced legislation requiring voters to show photo ID to vote. Here in Virginia, our legislature has passed a restrictive voter ID bill that's waiting for the governor's signature. By contrast, before 2011, only 2 states had ever imposed strict photo ID requirements. What does this mean? 11% of American citizens do not possess a government-issued photo ID. That means more than 21 million Americans are ineligible to vote unless they get one. Other voter restriction efforts include laws that require proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. In other words, you have to present a birth certificate to register to vote. These include Alabama, Kansas, and Tennessee. 16 states have introduced bills making it harder to vote, eliminating same-day registration or other voter mobilization efforts, and laws that make it harder to restore the rights of those who've been convicted of felonies have been passed in Florida and Iowa, effectively permanently disenfranchising those individuals. These facts demonstrate that despite critical accomplishments of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, much work remains to be done today. My own coalition, the Rights Working Group, is working on the issue of racial profiling. Now, racial profiling has been around for centuries, even if the term was coined more recently. Perhaps one of the earliest policies promoting racial profiling was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It required that any federal marshal or other official who did not arrest an alleged runaway slave was liable to a fine of $1,000. Law enforcement officials everywhere now had a duty to arrest anyone suspected of being a runaway slave. And no more evidence was required than the claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. The suspected slave could not ask for a jury trial and could not testify on his or her own behalf. And any person aiding a runaway slave, an alleged runaway slave, including by providing food or shelter, was subject to 6 months imprisonment and a $1,000 fine. Since any suspected slave was not eligible for a trial, you can imagine this led to a number of free blacks being conscripted into slavery because they had no rights in court and they could not defend themselves against the accusations. Well, let's fast forward to today. I'm going to pick a little bit on the New York City Police Department this morning, not only because they are infamous for being a rogue agency with frequent media accounts of their civil liberties violations, but because we've all grown up watching TV shows where the NYPD officers are the heroes, and we need to shatter that image. According to the data collected and revealed by the NYPD themselves, more than 4 million New Yorkers were subjected to police stops and searches from 2004 to 2011. Now, of these 4 million people, Black and Latino communities continue to be the overwhelming target of this tactic. For example, in 2011, more than 630,000 people were stopped and frisked by New York City police. Blacks and Latinos constituted 87% of all those stopped. This is the police's data, mind you, not ours. And even though they only constitute 54% of the city's population, 51% of those stopped were between the ages of 14 and 24. And yet, 88%, almost 9 out of 10, were completely innocent and not charged with a thing. So the NYPD, who was forced to collect this data in response to previous lawsuits over racial profiling, cites the lower crime rates in New York as the result of these stops and frisks. The craziest part is that city residents actually approve of this tactic, with substantial majorities of white, Asian, and Latino residents supporting the use of stop and frisk. These statistics should be troubling to all of us, but that's not the only illegal profiling that's taking place in New York. Starting last August, reporters at the Associated Press began a series of articles documenting how the NYPD has been surveilling Muslim communities, not only in New York City, but in fact, in upstate New York, in Connecticut, in New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, that we have found so far. The AP articles have revealed that it has been an internal policy to focus on communities who are Muslim, not because of any indication of criminal activity or behavior, but the police have spied on cafes owned by Muslims, on Muslim students going whitewater rafting, on mosques where Muslims are praying. They've taken copious notes, and they've submitted reports on these innocent and, by the way, constitutionally protected activities all the way up to the police commissioner's office. Astoundingly, the police commissioner and the mayor, Bloomberg, have defended these activities as necessary in the name of national security. They claim that because New York has not suffered another attack since September 11th, that these actions are justified. But let's say you're not Muslim or Latino or African American. You should still be concerned, because the intelligence department of the NYPD may also be spying on you for your political ideology or membership in a political party, because you've tweeted or posted something on Facebook, maybe sharing an article about what's happening in Afghanistan or what the latest political debates are in your community, because you work for a progressive organization that organizes communities, because you attend a protest about the war or economic deprivation, or because you marched in a rally for peace. So we in this room can all express a huge sigh of relief that we're not living in New York right now, right? But can we? No. The NYPD is using funding from the White House to support the war on drugs to spy on Muslim communities. The White House claims that it has no control over how local jurisdictions use the funding once it's been allocated. So who else is using their money in ways that we don't know? What other police departments have decided to investigate radical thinking or religious minorities? Do you think it's limited to New York? In the last few years, we've learned that the FBI has been providing training to its agents and to local police departments all across the country to explain Islam in the context of countering terrorism. These trainings have been revealed as grossly discriminatory, casting Muslims as threats, as embracing violence and terrorism, and encouraging suspicion of the entire religion. What does this mean about the police here in Charlottesville, who may have received FBI training or who collaborate with the FBI in investigations or in surveillance? Do you feel safer? It's time for a new movement, a movement for human rights that brings together all affected communities in a struggle to protect and promote the rights of all. How do we do this? What's happening today that should give us hope? How about Occupy Wall Street? Occupy Wall Street is a leaderless protest movement that started last September in Zuccotti Park in New York City's Wall Street district. Within the first month, Occupy Wall Street led to protests in over 95 cities in 82 countries. The protests are against social and economic inequality, greed, corruption, the undue influence of corporations on our government. Their slogan, "We are the 99%, addresses the growing income inequality between the wealthiest 1% and the rest of us. To effect change, Occupy Wall Street engages in direct action. If Ella Baker were here with us today, I know she'd be out there joining the protesters in Zuccotti Park, joining the debates in the General Assemblies, and inspiring young people once again with her vision of a people-centered movement. Trayvon Martin. I'm betting everybody in this room has heard about the tragic shooting of Trayvon, a 18-year-old boy who was shot by a 28-year-old neighborhood watch volunteer when walking home from the 7-Eleven with an iced tea and some Skittles. Because the shooter, George Zimmerman, claimed that he was acting in self-defense, the police who appeared on the scene did not arrest him, and he is not in custody today. In some ways, what happened to Trayvon appears as a vicious reminder of the past, of times when the killing of young black men meant no investigation or action by the police, and the complete lack of accountability of the murderer. But look at the response. And on Wednesday, let's say it again, on Wednesday night at 7 p.m. here in Charlottesville, we are having conversations about racial profiling. There have been protests across the United States with hundreds and thousands of people taking to the streets to demand justice. More than 2 million people signed a petition on change.org. It's the largest number of signatures on any petition ever launched by that website. The U.S. Department of Justice has started an investigation into the police handling of the case, and the chief of the Sanford City Police Department resigned after a no-confidence vote by the City Commission. The family of Trayvon, and his parents especially, have publicly called for the arrest of Zimmerman and for accountability within the police department. We've seen how hard it has been for them to get any response. Can you imagine what it would be like without those public displays of support? Without the millions of petitioners, the hundreds, the thousands of people marching in the streets? In truth, such a response should be done after every unjust act of police brutality, after every hate crime, after each incidence of racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. But this is a start. Occupy Wall Street and the Campaign for Trayvon are important demonstrations of the power of grassroots movements. These campaigns have not been mobilized by leaders, by charismatic individuals who make the decisions about where and how to move. They are spontaneous actions sprung up in different parts of the country, of the world. They reflect a genuine desire for change, led by people, by individuals choosing to take action, to get involved. Now let's look at what's happening in the population of the U.S. The 2010 census reports that we have 308 million people living in the U.S. Who are we? Increasingly, strikingly, we are a country of incredible diversity. In the 2010 census, Hispanics went from being 13% of the population to 16%. More than half of the growth of the country's population is due to the increase in the Latino population. They're projected to be 30% of the population in 2050. The Asian population grew faster than any other major race group between 2000 and 2010. African Americans had the third largest numeric increase in population size, growing to now 13% of the total population. 5 states, Texas, California, New Mexico, Hawaii, and DC, which I know is not a state, but we'll keep pushing on that, became majority minority states in 2010. About 1/10 of all counties in the United States have a population that is majority minority. And in 2050, the entire country will become a majority minority country. What does it mean? It means that we have to start rethinking about political power. It means that politicians will no longer be able to win elections by pandering to one racial group. They will have to represent a plurality of constituencies in their districts. It means that a grassroots human rights movement has the potential to achieve real and lasting change. We need to build a genuine human rights movement in the U.S. Ella Baker called for radical change, for participatory democracy, led by those who have been most marginalized by economic, social, and political repression. Her argument was that a movement must include representatives of all racial, gender, class, ideological groups, that all of us are needed to push for reforms. Ella Baker's grassroots organizing style is needed today more than ever. Today, the states of Arizona, Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, South Carolina, and Utah have passed laws requiring the police to stop and ask for papers from anyone whom they suspect of being undocumented. Copycat laws are still being considered in a number of other states. Today, 54 million people, eligible Americans, are not registered to vote. 54 million. 5.3 million have been denied the right to vote because of a felony conviction. Today, private corporations operating detention facilities are working with state legislators to enact new laws mandating minimum sentencing requirements and increasing the detention of undocumented immigrants. Profits in this industry are at record levels. Today, the deep economic recession of the last few years has resulted in increasing poverty levels across the U.S., the highest levels seen since the early 1990s. Nearly 1 in 6 Americans is living in poverty. That means 46 million people living in the United States are below the poverty line. Today, the U.S. government still goes to the United Nations and to other international bodies and claims exceptional leadership in promoting human rights. Now, let's think about tomorrow. How do we change this picture? Tomorrow, let's live in a world where no one goes hungry, where everyone has shelter, where there are equitable opportunities for everyone to learn and to find jobs. Tomorrow, let's live in a world where every vote counts, where every person has a vote. We let 16-year-olds drive cars, and we don't want them to have a political voice in the system. Laws must be reformed to make voter registration easier, to give everyone time off from work to cast their ballot, to restore full voting rights to everyone regardless of their criminal history. Tomorrow, let's live in a world where education is the highest priority of our society, where teachers are compensated at their true worth, where students are offered every opportunity to excel and to meet their full potential. Tomorrow, let's live in a world where community security is defined by the residents' values and needs, not by the overhyping of the terrorist threat. Where no one is suspicious based on their race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. And where the performance of law enforcement is judged based on their protection of human rights and civil liberties, not on the number of arrests they've made. Tomorrow, let's live in a world where all of us in the United States share a collective vision for participatory democracy, accountable government, and human rights for all. Ella Baker believed that we must let the disenfranchised vote, let the silenced be heard, let the oppressed be empowered, and let the marginalized move to the center. I hope you all will join me in building this world of tomorrow, in following the footsteps of Ella Baker. And until Ella Baker Day is recognized here in Virginia, let's use this campaign as our rallying cry for building a domestic human rights movement together. Thank you.